Welcome to the Nate Wenke Podcast. This episode is going to be a bit unstructured again. I was thinking about what to talk about this week, and frankly, it's been a rather stressful week in my life, and I didn't have a specific topic prepared in terms of well-researched about a book or anything specific, but the fact that it had been stressful brought up an interesting point about the importance of counseling and the importance of having people in your life that you can talk to about difficult situations, things that are going on in your life, to get advice from. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about my own personal experience with counseling specifically, or having someone mentor you. And then also just the importance of that as such. Because I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of having someone to work through reality with. And this is something that I learned several years ago, and it was absolutely astonishing. So the worst kind of punishment that you can receive is solitary confinement. So you take this group of antisocial, violent, aggressive males, and the worst thing that you can do to them is leave them alone. And it seems incredibly counterintuitive, but it goes to such a critical point that I think people underestimate sometimes, which is that we need other people in our lives. And more specifically, we need other people in our lives to help make sense of them. Because life is extremely complicated, and when you don't have anyone else to bounce your ideas off of or discuss what's going on in your brain or your different your emotional state or anything in that category, it's very easy to fail to recognize good ideas and fail to recognize bad ideas. And that can lead you down some very, let's just say, ill-advised paths. And I've experienced this personally. So I have a bit of an interesting history with counseling, and maybe some people will resonate with this. But initially, my parents forced me to go to counseling when I was in I think it was 8th grade or something like that, because I had horrible anxiety when I was a kid. Still have some of that today, but that's a different discussion, I suppose. And I hated the idea. I fought them vehemently on it. And I think the idea was, at least in my head at the time, was that I felt like admitting that I needed to admitting that I needed to talk to someone about, my hypothetical problems was somehow meaning that I was weak, that I was incapable of dealing with them, and that I was a failure because of it. It was a reflection of my very own character. And although I sympathize with that perspective, I just think it's fundamentally wrong. It isn't the case that there aren't times where people genuinely fail to properly grapple with their own problems in a proactive way and are, let's say, drafting or using other people around them as anchors in a way that isn't productive for them or the other people around them. But I think a lot of the time people just fail to recognize the importance of truthful speech in a meaningful relationship with someone else. And for me at the time, I didn't want to do it at all. But there's something unique about someone that's in a removed position from your life. They don't have the same... They're not influenced in any way by past experiences with you, by your own personal relationship. They're removed effectively from the situation, and then they also understand human psychology, which is just huge because they've had years and years of not only education, but hypothetically years or even sometimes decades of counseling sessions with other people, and can pick up on thought patterns that are destructive way, way quicker than your average person can. So it's extremely useful to see someone that has that kind of experience because they're able to identify things that you should let die and burn off, and they're able to identify things that you should focus on. And although my first experience with counseling was, I would say, relatively neutral, it wasn't particularly productive. It wasn't overly not productive. Over the past 2 years now, I've been seeing the same counselor, life coach, whatever word you want to use for it, even therapist. Again, a lot of these words have, I don't know, social stigma attached to them, which I think is just misplaced. So I've been seeing the same person for about 2 years now, and the joke in my family is that since my parents messed me up so much, they have to pay for it. And interestingly enough, they offered to. So in all fairness, it was their idea. And in the words of my father, I'm so messed up that, I obviously need counseling. So he offered to pay for it. So I was like, all right, well, I suppose why not? But one thing that I think is important here is that, and perhaps unique to me, but I'm not convinced it is that when I first decided to do it, I made a rule with my counselor. And I took this very seriously because I've been convinced of the reality of this through several different books, through personal experiences, from intuitions, etc. But I told my counselor that I would do everything in my power to tell him the truth as best as I could. And the reason that I think that is so important is because if you can't get at what is true, you're never going to be able to actually figure out how to solve whatever problem you're dealing with. If you don't have reality on your side in sorting through the complexity of relationships, emotions, life, consciousness, etc., you're just not going to make much progress. And I've been convinced of this through a number of different sources, but one specifically was a book called The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I've referenced this book before, but the book is a description of the absolute catastrophe of the Soviet state in the 20th century, and Solzhenitsyn is a very interesting character, and he lived through this system of gulags, the system of effectively concentration camps that was so horrible and soul-crushing, and he took a very interesting perspective about it. Essentially, he, instead of blaming his state on, Stalin or the people that had falsely accused him of things and gave him an absolutely outrageous sentence, he chose to spend the endless hours that he had in the camp to dissect his life and every choice that he made in his life, and to determine whether or not the choice that he made or the thing that he said oriented him towards the truth or orientated him away from it. And what he came to the conclusion of was that a huge amount of the reason that he was in the camp was because of decisions that he made. And this is a line that Dostoevsky has, which is that not only is a man responsible for the things he does, but he's responsible for everything else. And it's an extreme statement, and I may have gotten that slightly off, but it's roughly along those lines. But it's an interesting inversion of what we typically do, which is we typically tend to look for blame in other people, and we tend to look towards the circumstances outside of our control to oriented us in terms of how we got to where we're at. And it's not that you can't do that, but what Solzhenitsyn did is he took the complete opposite approach. He decided, I'm going to analyze and figure out exactly how I got here and how I contributed to how I'm here. And his conclusion was that it was his fault, effectively speaking. And then his next conclusion, after, again, hundreds of hours of meditation and deep reflection on the world around him and his own reality, was that the key, the fundamental thing, the fundamental axiom, perhaps, that brought about the Soviet state was the pathological, the abandonment of truth of the individual Soviet citizens, is one way to put it. That reality had gotten so pathologized. You know what I'm trying to say. It's been a week. Reality had become so corrupt with lies and with people proclaiming falsehoods that it degenerated into hell, effectively speaking. And what was interesting also about his conclusion is that he decided to write the book that he did, which was kind of a cry out against the censorship and destructive evil forces of the Soviet state. And he declared in stark detail what had happened and why it had happened. And what was interesting is that that book was arguably one of the reasons that the Soviet state actually ended up collapsing. So one man that decided to tell the truth contributed in a most serious way to the destruction of one of, if not the worst regime in history, which is absolutely fascinating. And I remember reading this and thinking, okay, so what does this mean for my own life? One. And what does this mean for the people around me? And what I've noticed then, and then back to my counselor and I, is the reason that I made that declaration of him of, I'm going to do everything in my power to tell you the truth to the best of my ability, because this is an important caveat here that I think is worth discussing, which is that it's one thing, and this is one of Jordan Peterson's rules, which is tell the truth or at least don't lie. And what I like about that rule is he added in at least don't lie, because it turns out that it's not always easy to know what the truth is. I think he recognized, and I would agree with this, that it's not always easy to know the perfect truth in a situation. Situations are too complicated sometimes to know what the right answer is. But what he does think that you can do is know when you're being false and know when you're lying. And I would agree with this. And another interesting side note to this is that this is the same psychology, the same reality that Socrates came to. And Socrates is a very interesting character. He had this concept of what he called a daemon, and essentially it's akin to the idea of your conscience. And what Socrates would do is he would always try to listen to what his daemon or conscience told him. But what was interesting is that it wouldn't tell him what to do, it would tell him what not to do. So it would, in action, he would be self-conscious of, one way of thinking about it is he would be self-conscious of whether or not the thing he was going to do or going to say would make him more aligned as a person or bring him apart. And he actually took this to the extreme in some sense, because he essentially, there was a trial in Athens that they were going to put Socrates on trial because he was corrupting the youth by asking them questions and telling them that they might not know as much as they think they do. And, you know, they wanted to get the old guy out of town, let's say. So they put the trial to a fairly distant date. They didn't want to actually kill him. They just wanted him to leave. They wanted to get rid of him. He was a nuisance. It was a small place, 20,000 people or so in Athens at the time. So everyone knew each other. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew who the accusers was. And he had basically every incentive to leave. All his friends wanted him to leave. We actually have the manuscript of one of his conversations with his friend Crito while he's in prison, where he essentially takes a rational, pragmatic view to whether or not he should leave before the trial. And he went and he consulted, is one way to put it, he consulted his conscience, he consulted his daemon, and his daemon told him not to leave, which was a bit of a shock to him because, you know, well, he wanted to live, and he also felt, rightly so, that the trial and the accusations brought against him were absolutely ridiculous. So it was quite the shock to him to have the very thing that had guided him to be called by the Delphic oracle the wisest man in the world, the very attitude and orientation towards life that he had taken that had kept him aligned as an individual and granted him wisdom that was renowned across the land, that very thing that had not led him astray to tell him something that was the complete opposite of the conclusion that he had come to. And as only a true philosopher would do, is he assumed that his assumptions and feelings and intuitions about the situation were wrong and that he should listen to his daemon. So he decided to stay and face his accusers in the trial. And sure enough, they convicted him and put him to death. And what's interesting about the trial, too, is that in the trial, he exposes his accusers for just the absolute corrupt, pathetic people that they were. And in one way, he went to his death with his soul intact, with his conscience clear. It's an interesting goal, and it's a fascinating story, and Socrates in general is a incredibly unique person, and I highly recommend reading the trial. It's not that long, and it's a fascinating read. So Socrates made this decision that no matter what, he was going to follow his daemon. He was going to do everything in his power to not be false. It's one way to put it. And that brings us back to this idea of counseling and my initial proclamation of that I would do what I could to avoid falsehood. And it's something that I've tried to do with the people around me as well. And I will admit I do not always live up to this. But in one of my closer relationships with Harley, my roommate and my best friend, we've made an agreement, and I think we formally made it, let's say, at the beginning of college, but it was more or less a unspoken agreement between us, as I think all true friendships should have, which is one based upon truth, which is one based upon we are orientated towards the truth, and we're going to use love as our guide to do everything in our power to correct each other and keep each other sharp and sort out what is false from what is true and follow the straight and narrow path, as the saying goes. And it served us very well because there's been very difficult times in both of our lives where there was nothing but the truth that would have been able to, quote unquote, save us. The truth will set you free, as the saying goes. And I've found this to be true, interestingly enough. In every counseling session, that as the guide has led to the most progress. Now, again, it's not always easy to know what is true, but it's easy to know, or at least you can learn to listen to your internal conscience for signals as to when you're being false, when you're lying. And I believe that's a human universal. I genuinely do. And I think this is one reason that truth is so important in relationships is people have experienced this, of course, but you can imagine that there's a bit of a risk in a relationship. There's a bit of in order to truly deeply connect with someone, you have to be vulnerable. And you have to let them into your own little world and let them in to see where your own idiosyncratic inefficiencies and the ways in which you fail to live up to who you claim to be and who you could be. And it's a difficult thing, but a true relationship requires vulnerability. It requires you to let someone in. But in doing that, you give them a sort of power. You give them a sort of sway over you. And it's a risk. And I think this is why betrayal and why when people cheat or when people lie and are false, it hurts so much because you've given them a way, you've been vulnerable with them. You've allowed your guard down. And then let's say that you get betrayed. Your very fundamental view of both of them and then also you has to be recalibrated. Your axiomatic thoughts about who you are as a person, as someone that doesn't get tricked, as someone that isn't naive, of someone that isn't going to be simply spit on. You have to reassess that because perhaps it's not just that they were such a horrible person, but perhaps it's because you let yourself get taken advantage of, which is a hard pill to swallow, and it's not always the case, but nonetheless, those thoughts are going to arise nonetheless. And I think that's why in Dante's Inferno, the lowest level of hell is left for those who betrayed other people. Because in some sense, it's the worst thing that you can do to another person. Just betray them. So we need more truth in our lives. We need more authentic relationships. And I was just reading some statistics on loneliness and the number of actual meaningful relationships that people have in the U.S. on average these days. And it's absolutely abysmal. It's horrible. We live in a generation that's more connected than ever, and yet we're more lonely than ever. There's less romantic relationships than ever. 15% of U.S. adults don't have one close friend, I believe. It's either U.S. adults or it's men. I can't remember. Regardless, it's abysmal. And I think about the reality of not having someone to talk to, not having someone to work through the complexity of reality with. And that's absolutely terrifying. I don't know how people do it. I would go crazy. Which brings me back to the solitary confinement thing. Like, the worst thing you can do to people is leave them alone in a place full of sociopaths and psychopaths and murderers. It's insane. It's absolutely crazy. So, go to counseling. No, that's not the thesis here. It could be though. I find it very useful. We've worked through a lot of tricky subjects that it's helpful to have a outside perspective, someone that's removed from my personal life. It's very useful. Let's see. Like I said, it's been a week, so I think I'm probably going to call it early here. Hit on Socrates. Hit on Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Very good book. Highly recommend. Terrifying book, though. Not for the faint of heart. Very difficult book. Jordan Peterson's Rule. His whole book is good. I mean, no doubt. That's probably one of my favorite rules, is the tell the truth or at least don't lie. And he does a hell of a lot of better job than I do explaining why it's so important. But it's a very good rule. Highly recommend. So, we all need meaningful relationships. And the best way to have them is to have them based upon truth in an authentic way. So if you can't be vulnerable with someone, if you can't open up to them, you're never going to form a deep connection with them, period. And it's a risk. It's a risk. Because you don't know what they're going to do with that information. You don't know how they're going to treat you when that occurs. But if it wasn't worth the risk, then what's the point? What's the point of all this? It's got to be worth the risk. Even when it seems like it isn't sometimes. So, tell the truth. It's a hell of a lot better than the other thing. Have reality on your side. Might as well. What do you think? You're going to win against reality? It's like, yeah. Good luck with that. I think we'll end with that. Have reality on your side. Thank you for listening.